There are fairies on the farm.
My novel, The Ghost of Nothing, is now an award winner, so if you like this channel, I know you'll like it, so be sure to check it out. It's available at bookstores and on audio. I was perhaps 3 or 4 years old at the time. My father and I were attending a pool party. While we were there, he hung around with his friends while I played with the one other child who was present, a young, pale-skinned boy around my age. The kid was fun and interesting, but most of all, he was very happy. The main thing I remember about his appearance was his smile. At one point, he wanted us to go into the pool. I explained that I hadn't learned to swim yet, and he answered by saying we could go on the inflatable floating lounge chair that was perched along the side of the water. I reluctantly agreed, and we walked over to the lounge chair and sat down, pushing off the side of the pool with our hands to send ourselves into the middle of the water. That was when the child turned to me and, still smiling, shoved me into the deep end of the pool. The next thing I knew, my father was diving in to rescue me while I cried and coughed up the water. The weird thing is, whenever I ask my dad about the incident, he remembers it differently than I do. According to him, there was no other child at that party. All alone, I had apparently walked straight off the edge of the deck into the deep end of the pool, as if I was expecting solid ground. For years, I put the incident out of my mind, hoping to forget it in time. That is, until my friend explained the folklore behind fairies and their mischievous and often sadistic nature. I'm ever the skeptic, but I know what I saw. I know what happened to me. And it's apparently similar to some other stories people have had over the centuries, such as being lured into the woods or attacked near water. Why do I think it was a fairy? The mischievous nature of my assaulter combined with the fact that a witness had a very different experience of the situation. Several years ago, I was traveling through Iceland. I'm American. I was staying at a bed and breakfast with a group of fellow tourists. After dinner, I went outside to walk along the river next to the building. I walked about half a mile down the river, then turned back along the shore. It was night, but the lights from the building illuminated the area well enough. Standing at the edge of the water, I looked out and saw an older-looking man dressed all in black, standing hip-deep in the water. He had a fishing rod and was casting, reeling in, and casting again without stopping. He was about 6 feet tall, white hair, black clothes. He walked forward toward a waterfall downstream. There was something eerie and otherworldly about him, and it was unnerving. The air felt tense. I froze where I was standing. Suddenly, I felt like I couldn't move. I could only hear the water. The man kept walking until he was perhaps a dozen feet from the waterfall. Then he disappeared. He did not get out of the river on my side. The other side was a nearly sheer hillside. He simply vanished from sight. When he disappeared, the tense air went with him, and I found I could move again. I walked along the shore downstream a bit past the waterfall, but there was no sign of the man. He was completely gone. I found out later the area had a reputation for the presence of the Alfar. The being had seemed tangible. I could see the water flowing around him. He didn't seem like an alien or angel, but was not human. I feel certain of that. I think fairies are otherworldly beings. I was out on a commercial fishing boat with my best friend and her family. The night before, we had seen a strange light in the sky. The adults were scared, but us kids were fine. The next morning, the adults dropped us off into a marine reserve island so we could run around. Me, my best friend, same age, 9, and her older brother, 12 or 13. We rowed over in a dinghy, beautiful, clear, and calm day in summer, onto a smallish island that was covered in trees. Just as kids landed onto the island, and once on the beach, we decided to play hide and seek. We all split up, and I remember walking through the bush. It wasn't dense, just a lot of trees, up toward a hill. As I got closer to the hill, everything seemed to fuzz, but also get clearer and brighter. As I came to the top of the hill, I saw a beautiful, green, huge tree. And at the base of this huge tree were 3 beings. A tall, long-haired blonde man to the right, a small ball of light like Tinkerbell to the left, and in the middle there was a short man. This man I thought of immediately as the brown man, because he was dressed all in brown and his hair and eyes were brown, and his skin matched the tone of his clothing. His clothing was old-fashioned looking with big brown buttons, and his hat was old and battered. His pants and shirt were made of coarse-looking material, but well-worn. He had kind but twinkling eyes, mischievous but definitely kind. Of the 3, this was the one I was most drawn to. We had a conversation, and I agreed to do something for them. All 3 of them that had something to do with trees, but I can't remember what. The conversation only seemed to last a few minutes. Then I heard my friends calling for me. They sounded scared. I said my goodbyes and turned away happily to go see my friends. But when I found them, they told me I had been missing a good half an hour, and they had been yelling for ages and couldn't find me anywhere. I didn't explain to them what had happened. For some reason, I felt I just couldn't. So we all went back to the dinghy and then rowed back to the boat. I don't know what to make of the experience. I've had ghost experiences. They run in my family on my mom's side. Not keen on them and tend to just be respectful and ask them to go away. But this was different, much more real and strange at the same time. I do believe in fairies, but don't always believe when other people share their experiences, so who knows if anyone will believe this. All I can say is that it happened, and I'm relaying it as I remember it. It was my 15th birthday, March 20th, 2006. I was walking along a hiking trail with 3 friends, 2 girls and a boy my age. It was about 5 o'clock or a little later. The weather was gray and overcast with drizzly rain. We were going through a heavily wooded area and the trail was narrow, so we went single file. We climbed up a hill, and as we were walking down the other side, I noticed something ahead and a bit to the right of me, between 2 younger trees. It looked like a person, and yet I was sure that it wasn't. I stopped walking. It looked directly at me. He was taller than me, maybe 5 feet 5 inches to 5 foot 7 inches. He had tanned skin, leaning toward dark, and fair, straight hair. He was naked from the waist up and wearing dark clothing from the waist down. He was a human-looking face, but his eyes were a bit too big, and I couldn't see any whites in them, just dark. I expected the fairy to disappear or take off as soon as I looked directly at him, and so I waited breathlessly for a second. But he didn't move. I could still see him. I asked my friends if they saw anything up ahead, and they got very quiet and said no. One friend asked if I was all right. I was afraid, but without turning around, I didn't want to look away from the fairy person thing. I told them to get back to the main trail. I was the leader of my little group of friends, and I think they understood I was serious, since the laughing, happy mood quickly evaporated, and they just agreed. I stayed exactly where I was, staring at the fairy, afraid to move or turn my back. When I realized my legs were shaking, I stood up really straight and stuck out my chin and tried to look brave and unconcerned. We had a stare-off for a minute, or maybe a minute and a half, before I said out loud, "I'm leaving now." And then I did. I turned around and walked quickly, doing my best not to run, back to the main trail. But I told them I couldn't explain it. My heart was pounding, and I felt quite sick to my stomach, like after you get a burst of adrenaline. One of my friends assumed that I had seen a ghost. They were really into that sort of thing. So I didn't deny it and didn't confirm it and just let them think that, since the truth seems so much more outrageous and unreal. I'm not sure it was a fairy, that's just what seems to best fit what I saw. The fairy seemed solid, real, and earthy, kind of animal-like, even though it looked sort of like a human. I don't know how the fairy felt about me. He didn't really have a facial expression. He just stared at me. I don't know if it was friendly or malevolent or what. I was just scared to be seeing something that I'd never seen before, and that seemed like it shouldn't exist. My experience took place on a summer's afternoon in the yard of a medieval church in Suffolk. I often visit churches and other old and interesting historic places. These days I enjoy exploring country roads by bicycle. But at the time, I must have been 19 and only driving for about 18 months, so everything was done by car. It was late afternoon or early evening, but still full daylight. I had stopped to have a look around an old church and had already been inside. After leaving, I decided to walk around the outside of the building to take in the architecture and look for any unusual decoration. When I got to the back of the church, I noticed there was a large iron sanctuary knocker on the locked back door. A sanctuary knocker is a stylized door knocker that can be found on the doors of certain old churches and cathedrals. In the Middle Ages, if you touched one, you could gain sanctuary inside the church. I had walked up and taken hold of the handle to study the metalwork when I felt the sensation of someone watching me. When I turned around, to my surprise, there was someone watching me from the other side of a hedge, which was about 15 or so feet away. This hedge was chest high and formed the boundary of the churchyard. This person who was looking at me had a thin face that tapered to a very narrow jaw and small chin. Its nose was fine, and its lips were small and thin, and it had long, straight, light brown hair and big eyes that were a deep blue, without white or pupil. The eyes and the dimension of the face were strange and inhuman, but not unpleasant. I think I half spoke a greeting, and I remember it smiled slightly, and I got the impression that it was female. We maintained eye contact for several long seconds until I couldn't hold the stare any longer and had to blink. In the moment it took me to blink, it fled, and as my eyes opened, I caught the motion of it ducking down behind the hedge. I was overcome with the urge to know, to understand, to experience, and I rushed to the hedge and looked over to see where it had gone. On the other side was an empty field with nowhere to hide. About 100 yards away, flanking the field on the left, was a large house, and about half that distance away on the right was a small wood. But the watcher had disappeared entirely. I thought to myself how odd the experience was, and began to feel uncomfortable, so I went back around the church to my car at not much less than a run, and drove away. I've gone over the experience in my mind countless times since then, and have come to the conclusion that, as I was well clear of the hedge, it must have been a little taller than my own 5'10". But I have no memory of whether it was dressed or naked, just the impression that it was tall and thin. I remember that as I held the gaze of those eyes, her face seemed to take up my entire view, so that in my memory she seems closer to me than I know she must have been. It seemed at one with that peaceful place, not of the church, but the field and the wood. I think fairies are spirits of the natural world, or perhaps the animals, and people of another realm of existence alongside our own. I met a woman once who described to me her experience of what she called an elf. Her description matched the being I met almost exactly. I'm an American. Several years ago, I took a course in Devon, England that was put on by a local mythologist. It was a myth school, a full weekend event, which I enjoyed very much. For the duration of the event, I stayed at a hostel. But I was having such a great time, I decided to extend my stay for an additional 2 days after the event ended. So at this point, everyone else had left, and the only other human around was the hostel owner, who stayed in a separate building with his dogs. After a day of hiking the moors and time spent doing a powerful ancestor ceremony, I was in bed sleeping when I suddenly woke up. Right away, I realized many of them, I would say at least 50, and they seemed to be passing through the room from one side to the other in a procession. They were beings of all kinds, strange and amazing, and in various sizes, from tall as the tallest humans I've ever seen to a few inches in height. Some were beautiful, some hideous and animal-like, some small, some large, some female, some male, some unknown. They moved across the room without acknowledging me. It was like they couldn't see me. When they reached the far side of the room, they walked through the wall and continued outside. I could still see them through the window, but it was too dark outside to see where they went beyond that wild, riotous music emanating from who knows where. A male fairy came through the room last, rolling himself in what seemed like an ancient wagon wheel. He rolled it right through the wall and continued outside, and then the music faded and I couldn't see or hear them anymore. The normal sounds of the night returned, and it was like the whole thing didn't happen. The area I was staying has much fairy folklore, but I don't know that the hostel itself has any significance or relationship to fairies. I can only guess that the house is located on one of the fairies' trooping routes, and that they pass through there occasionally. I was just lucky to have woken up when I did. Lucky I was able to see them, and that's all that happened. This series of encounters started about 10 years ago in Tennessee. At that time, I frequently found myself in the woods behind my house during the day, and at night I sometimes spent time in my garden. I just generally had an urge to be out in nature at that time, sometimes very late, between midnight and 3 a.m. One particular night, I was alone in the garden. All was quiet when I noticed the hair on my arms prickling. I glanced toward the trees at the back of my garden, where there's a path that leads toward the wood, and standing next to one of the trees was a man. He was incredibly tall, around 6'5" to 7 feet, with long silvery blonde hair and pale skin. He had a pleasant face and no facial hair, and was dressed in a long-sleeved coat and pants in whitish and gold tones, tucked into tall boots. He just stood there, watching me, and then, in the blink of an eye, he vanished. This all happened so quickly I barely had time to react. I think I was shocked at first and froze, and then when he vanished, I was wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. And yet, he had seemed real, solid. I saw all those details about his clothing, and there were no shadows or objects around that were remotely like what I saw. Since then, I believe I've sensed his presence at various times, and I've caught glimpses of him briefly here and there. I've never been afraid of him. Somehow I feel like he means no harm, though I can't explain why. But there have been times when I was in the garden with someone else and felt an odd sense of aggravation. But alone, it's different. A curious feeling, as if he's waiting for something. This experience made me question everything I knew. I believed he was a fae, a being from folklore. This belief felt more plausible than any other explanation. I had never read about fae before my first encounter with him, but somehow I just knew that this was what he was. As I was washing dishes one afternoon, I spaced out. I was listening to one of your videos at the time, actually. Suddenly, I realized I couldn't move, and my sight was overwhelmed by a weird kind of vision. In the vision, these little people physically ran up to me and grabbed my arms. A portal appeared, and the little people dragged me through it. I found myself in a dark forest surrounded by other beings I can only describe as fairies. They were people of all sizes, some little like the ones that had brought me through the portal and others that were human-sized. A crowd of these people were yelling and cheering, celebrating my return. They called me by another name and explained that this was my real reality and that I had a real body that I had to return to. I was terrified. I insisted that they didn't know me, that the name they called me wasn't mine, and that I wanted to go back to my kitchen. This one man yelled, "That is not your home. It was never your home." Then they talked amongst themselves, and a lady asked, "Do you truly not remember?" Many of them asked me the same question, and something inside me felt conflicted, as if I wanted to remember but couldn't or wouldn't let myself. The man who yelled at me played a tune that stirred something deep within me. I felt like I recognized the melody, and for some reason it made me very angry. I told them I didn't want to be there. I wanted to go home right away. The man who'd been playing the tune seemed frustrated, and he turned his back to me. And suddenly the vision ended. I was back in my kitchen holding my dishes. I realized I could move again. I didn't know what to think about what had just happened. I'd never had an experience like this before. I'd never had a vision before, certainly not one that was so real and intense. But the more distant I became from the vision, the more time that passed, the more I started to wonder if it was all my imagination. Though after it had actually happened, I didn't even consider this for a second. It had all been so real. For years afterwards, I had strange dreams on and off of that same man, and in each dream he tried to persuade me to return to them. I don't know what any of this means, but the only way I can describe this experience that makes any sense to me is fairy. Thanks for watching, and thanks to all those who submitted their stories for this one. I have a quick announcement. I just found out recently that my novel, The Ghost of Nothing, has won an award. It's called the Indie Brag Award, which stands for Book Readers Appreciation Group. I was very excited when I found out about this award. You know, when you write a book, you don't really know if anyone will read it, let alone like it and appreciate it. So it's very encouraging to receive this kind of recognition, especially since this is something that I put so much time and passion into writing. I had a vision with this novel. I really wanted to capture the way that I imagine the fairy world to be. I wanted to capture the spirit of the fairy poetry that I always share in the comments on this channel and old folk beliefs about fairies and turn that into a tangible world, a place people could visit through this story and these characters. And I think I've accomplished that, and it's very encouraging to get this kind of recognition, especially since I'm working on the second book now and delving even deeper into the fairy world in this one. So I'm excited to share that one when it's eventually ready. So I just wanted to share that positive news with you guys, and thank you for all your support and encouragement on this channel. And thank all those who read the book, who gave it a chance, and double thanks to those who left me a review. I read them all, and they mean so much to me. So thank you guys so much from the bottom of my heart. If you have a true fairy encounter story to share, you can check out the channel's website at scaryfairygodmother.com, link in the description. It has a spot where you can submit your stories, comments, questions, and suggestions. You can also sign up for the mailing list that's dedicated to the channel called Fairy Lights. You could also head over to my writing website, linked below, and join the Shaken Tree, a mailing list that's dedicated exclusively to my writing and the fairy world I've developed for my books. As always, extra special thanks goes out to all of my supporters on Patreon and Substack, and to anyone who has joined the channel or made a one-time donation through PayPal or Ko-fi. I appreciate you guys so much and the support you are giving this work. If you like this channel and you would like to lend your support, please check out my Patreon or Substack pages or the other support options in the description below. I have started uploading versions of my videos that are ad-free, stories only, no intro, outro for channel members and Patreon members. So if that's something you're interested in, please consider becoming a member. The stories in this video came courtesy of subscribers and the Fairy Census, so thanks to everyone who submitted. The stories were edited for dramatic and narration reasons. To read the Census stories, please follow the link in the description. Don't forget to leave a comment below, like, share, and subscribe if you're new. It helps the channel so much when you do that, and hit the bell to receive notifications of new videos. And until next time, this has been a visit from your scary fairy godmother.